evening, everybody. A welcome from myself, Harun Borat, the director of the DPRU, the Development Policy Research Unit at the School of Economics, University of Cape Town. And a big thank you to all of you for coming this evening. It's a wonderful Cape Town evening. For those who are live streaming in, it's raining cats and dogs outside, so we have a dedicated audience who are really keen to listen to us, and we're happy that you've joined us. And for those who are live streaming in, welcome to this launch of the Counting Women's Work project, generously funded by the IDRC, and truly, I think, a landmark project within the School of Economics, and I think within Africa. I think it's fair to say for most economists, when we mention the phrase national transfer accounts, there's a little bit of a, okay, I need a bit of definition, I need a sense of what this means. It's not necessarily talking about endogeneity or econometric multicollinearity or something. And in a sense, I think the best way to understand it is about an understanding of current and future income flows between households, if the data allows it, within households, and between government and households. And in many senses, if you think about, particularly in the developed country context, but increasingly in an emerging market context, the notion of future pension needs, the notion of taking care of the aged, and so on, is in a sense where the interest and the importance and the centrality of the NTA work begun. But I think what's happened since then is that the NTA work has mushroomed, thanks very kindly to people like Gretchen Donhauer, who's going to present and lead on this, but herself and a whole bunch of people, principally from the developed world, have developed the techniques and the paradigms that they've generously now shared in the developing world. But what they've done in this particular project is take the focus away from the generic to the specific, and have gone from trying to understand NTA flows at a national level to focusing particularly, as you can guess, of course, on women. And needless to say, that remains a critical focus. Whether we look at, one can pick a social indicator. You can pick unemployment rates, you can pick household nutrition levels, you can pick poverty levels, poverty gaps, and women invariably are the more marginalized groups. So in a sense, trying to understand household or income security and income flows in relation to women and women's work, both at the household level and at the level of the labor market, is immensely important. And so I think we are privileged to have somebody of Gretchen's quality and her team around her to assist the multiple country teams that we have present here, which is the third, if you like, leg of importance in terms of what we're doing tonight, is that present in front of us are multiple countries from the continent, and we have Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, and of course South Africa, who are all involved in this NTA project. And I think for me, we know 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies over the last decade have been African. We know that the continent is seen as the last final frontier for foreign investors, for corporates. But I think it also is an important area in which to upgrade the quality of our research and the focus of our research. And I think this project tries to do that. So I'll stop there, just to note that we welcome both the IDRC, as I said, as funders, as well as the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and we thank them for that. The procedure from here onwards will be that Gretchen, who's the academic specialist at the Center for the Economics and Demography of Aging unit at UC Berkeley, and as I said, is directing this project. Gretchen will speak for about 15 minutes. Followed by, and Mona has told me to say 5 minutes exactly for each country team, so be warned. And Mona is a quiet fellow, I'm less so, so if you do go over your 5 minutes, I'll be there to wave you down. But the good news is there's a Q&A after that, and even better is that there are cocktails following that upstairs on the 4th floor. But let me hand over to Gretchen, and we look forward to listening to her. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the DPRU and the University of Cape Town for hosting us. And so, as was mentioned, I'm going to talk about the project as a whole, both the National Transfer Accounts Project and the Counting Women's Work Project generally, and then hand it over to the country teams to talk about their work in the African countries. So who are we? National Transfer Accounts is a project to measure the generational economy. That means we want to understand how we produce, consume, share, and save resources by age. We have research teams in over 40 countries, so we have many different types of economy, many different levels of development, many different societies that we are looking across. The Counting Women's Work Project is a project within National Transfer Accounts to add a gender perspective to that work. And one of the main innovative pieces of that is to recognize that there is work that is not included in national accounts. And so there's work that is not amenable to economic or policy analysis. So we are trying to make that work visible and discuss it in terms that are open to economic and policy analysis on the par with market work. So this is just a quick picture of the countries that National Transfer Accounts teams are in. We have excellent geographic coverage. You can see that we need a lot more African countries. So if any of you are in non-NTA countries and are interested in this research, or have colleagues who are interested in this research, we are always recruiting. So to be more specific about how we measure the generational economy, what you're seeing on the screen are NTA age profiles. The solid line is labor income, and the dotted line is consumption. So we also have age profiles of transfers, public and private, and then asset income and saving, but these are where we start, labor income and consumption. So labor income is earnings and self-employment income and fringe benefits, and then consumption includes all private consumption and public consumption. So where the government is providing consumption, that is also included here. So this is, the idea behind national transfer accounts is to take national accounts and disaggregate it by age. So that's what you're seeing here. So if these are per capita age profiles. So each point on those lines is an average for that age group. Now, if we multiplied this by the population and got the aggregate flow, it would be consistent with national accounts. So the reason that we start with this graph is that it shows in the different regions the young age life cycle deficit. So this is where children are consuming more than they're producing. This is where workers are producing more labor income than they need to consume. And then here is the old age life cycle deficit. And this is for the United States. In 2011, you can see that our old age life cycle deficit is very large, as we have very high consumption at the oldest ages. And so we used to call this graph the most important graph in the world, because those arrows showing how we're going to get resources from the working age population to the population that has a deficit is sort of one of the basic problems of economic organization. How do you get resources from those who create them to those who need them to consume? And so for children, that's mainly done through government and family transfers. You take care of your children in your home. The public sector provides education. But we also have, mostly for secondary, post-secondary education, people can take out loans and go into debt to consume education now that they'll pay back later. And then on the other end of the age scale, we have government and family transfers, and here assets play a much more important role, assets that you've saved during your working ages to consume during retirement. So what is the Counting Women's Work project trying to do to add gender onto this? So there are two main tasks, and the first one is to take our age profiles and then further disaggregate them by sex. So that's what you get when you go from a population average age profile, and when you think about it, there is no average person. It's much more salient to say the average man or the average woman or the average girl or the average boy. And that's what we see over here. So men are producing a lot more in the formal labor market. Their labor force participation rates are higher. They work more hours per week. They have jobs that are on average higher paying than the jobs that women have, and then they, even when they're the same job, they earn a little bit more than women. So the difference here between men and women rolls up all of those gender differences. So this is the effect of a whole system of gendered economic participation. Now on the consumption side, there's not much difference there, but that's more of a methodology issue that we're working on to get better estimation of the differences between men and women consuming. So what's missing from this picture? So when we say labor income and talk about work, that is just one kind of work. That's work that's in the labor market. So there's lots of work that is done that's not in the labor market. Cooking, taking care of children, this is getting water. So household responsibilities, cooking, cleaning, household management and maintenance. And then there's care, so care for children and care for the elderly. Now, if these are done outside of the market, if they're done for no pay by households, it is not included in any measure of national income. People have been trying to develop satellite accounts to measure this, to go along with national income, and we're joining that effort. So I wanted to show this too, because while the project is called Counting Women's Work, we're also counting it when men do it. So childcare, housework. I always put this slide up because this is my husband and my first child, so I like to show them off. So it's about counting women's work, with women's work as traditionally understood, but it is also about understanding everyone's work. So what do we think the solution is to this big blind spot in economic measurement and economic analysis and policy analysis? So that's the National Time Transfers Account, and the Counting Women's Work project is working to measure those. So we start with time use surveys to tell us how much time people spent doing housework, caring for household members, and the community. Also in education, although that's not part of the accounts, but it's an important thing we want to monitor so we understand the difference in time that boys and girls are able to spend on education and what gender implications that may have. So once we know what people are doing with their time, we use a market wage data to tell us how much that time is worth in the market. So if I were to pay someone to take care of my kid instead of take care of him myself, what would I have to pay? And then we have household structure that allows us to impute the consumption of time. So we know how much childcare was produced in a household. We know the ages of children in a household, so we impute the child care to those children, and then we can get a consumption estimate as well as a production estimate. So this consumption of time is another innovation of the Counting Women's Work project and of national time transfer accounts, because most people don't focus on the consumption of the time. So what do we get when we do this? So this picture I already showed, this is the market accounts disaggregated for men and women. But I'm going to add to that time-based accounts. So these are monetary denominations, but they're based on time and valuing the time with a market wage. So here is women specializing in household production. The blue lines are the production. Men are doing household production and care, but less. And then children are consuming a lot of time, a lot more than they're consuming in market goods and services. and elders are also consuming a fair bit of time. They're also producing a lot. But you can see that if all you are thinking about when you're thinking about the gendered economy is the market picture, you're missing a lot of production and a lot of constraint for what people can do in the labor market and in the household. So why are this is a big measurement project. We're trying to do it in as many countries as we have time use data for. And what do we hope to learn after we've done all of it? So first of all, as I was mentioning, just the the project, the framework for this, hopefully will help to make a more inclusive view of men's and women's work, to bring this household production and unpaid household services into the same realm as market work in terms of what we can look at and analyze. We're also going to learn, as that previous slide showed, the full cost of the dependency of children and elders. So if I'm doing an analysis on the cost of children, and all I measure is the goods and services that are given to them, I'm missing quite a lot more of what is required to take care of them. And then, well, in the United States, there's the difference between the transfers of elder care are very low because we do a lot of elder care in the market. That is not true in many different places around the world, so we're very interested in measuring that. So we also are able to get a more complete picture of the investment in girls and boys' human capital. And as I mentioned, the time that they are able to spend in education, we're also going to focus on, because enrollment rates tell you how, if it was possible for them to go to school, but the time that they spent in school, for high school kids mainly, because we can't measure time use for very young children, but for younger people, how much time were girls able to spend in school? How much time were boys able to spend in school? If there's a difference, is it because they had to work, they had to take care of siblings, or they have to work in the household farm or household-owned enterprise? So what sort of time demands might be preventing children from getting the maximum human capital investment that we would want them to have from education? And then there are many research questions that fall under the idea of quantifying the relationship between gender, market work, and household production. So are household production responsibilities keeping women out of market work? Are they keeping men, or are market responsibilities keeping men out of the household? Are they keeping girls and boys out of school? And in pretty much every country around the world, women's labor force participation is increasing over time. And so what is that going to mean if we spin that out into the future for the care demands of our society? How much care are we going to need to finance some other way? Or will we end up with the idea of the second shift, where women are working in the former labor market and then they come home and do everything they used to do before, to the great detriment of them as people and their well-being? And then also, when we think about the future, the long-term future of population aging, how might gender dynamics play into that? If we think that we will find our necessary workers in the future when there are fewer workers to support more elderly dependents, and we're looking to get that benefit from women joining the labor force, what are we going to do? What policies are necessary to take care of the household production and care work that they will not be able to do, that the time just won't be there if they're working in the labor market? So these are just some of the questions and the policy questions that we hope to be able to talk about as we get more results from more countries. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mornay to start our country-specific reports on South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, so for South Africa, we have been part of the NTA network since 2009, and we have estimated accounts for 2005. And I think one of the key sort of features that we are discovering in terms of our NTA estimates is that inequality is really an important driver of the results that we're getting. As we all know, inequality is an important characteristic of South African society at the moment, and we see that across demographic and locational characteristics, so by race, by gender, by age, by location. These are all important drivers or covariates of inequality. And we've seen over the last 20 years or so that inequality has been worsening over time. And one of the things that NTA is starting to help us look at is the possible link between this worsening inequality and the patterns of resource flows across the life cycle. Obviously, inequalities can build up over one's life, and so this is something that's quite interesting to look at from the NTA perspective. In terms of another aspect that is quite important at the moment is the demographic dividend, and a lot of countries, particularly in Africa, are talking about the demographic dividend and are quite excited about the prospect of these demographic dividends. Now, South Africa is probably one of the furthest along in terms of the demographic transition amongst African countries, and we estimate that we're roughly halfway through our demographic dividend process, which began in the mid-1970s. So obviously, one of the key concerns is that over the last 40 years, there have been issues in terms of human capital accumulation in South Africa. And this has important implications in terms of our ability to reap the dividend in the future. Just to give you an idea of the patterns in South Africa, I've plotted here the labor income and consumption profiles for 2005. But just to give you an idea, those bands are the interquartile ranges of NTA countries, so that you can see sort of where we fit in or don't fit in relative to other countries. So I think there are three quite interesting aspects in terms of this graph. The first is that youth unemployment, which we know is a problem, we can see quite clearly in the NTA estimates. Our labor income graph, for example, takes a really long time to start rising, and it rises much later than other countries. I think there are about 3 or 4 countries in the world for which we have estimates where there's a later rise in labor income. So this obviously is an important concern for us. We also see quite a rapid exit from the labor market amongst the elderly in South Africa. So you can see our labor income graph declines very rapidly relative to that interquartile range. And this is also important in terms of the way that we finance the consumption of the elderly and how we sustain living standards amongst the elderly. And then the third is this declining consumption amongst the elderly that we see. And so in a lot of countries, you don't see that. You can see the interquartile range stays pretty much stable over that period, or over those ages. And so this is an area of concern for South Africa in terms of how do we share resources with the elderly so that they can consume. In terms of why are we interested in counting women's work in South Africa? So despite our constitution and the policy framework that we have, which is very progressive in terms of gender rights and gender equality, South African women continue to face various disadvantages and constraints. So we know from a huge amount of research that's been going on is that women have higher unemployment rates than men. When they're employed, they earn less, they are in less secure employment, and typically in less skilled occupations. While education, in terms of education, enrollment and graduation is relatively equal across the genders. We find, for example, that women are much less likely to graduate from science, engineering and technology fields, which are fields where employment prospects are best. We also know that women spend more time in unpaid housework and care, and they actually spend more time in productive activities overall relative to men. And this is from Stats SA's Time Use Survey, those statistics. Women spend 408 minutes on average per day in productive activities versus 356 minutes per day for men. Women are also more likely to be poor. They're more likely to lack access to piped water, to use wood for cooking, to travel long distances to fetch water and fuel. And this all has impacts in terms of their ability to participate in the economy and long-term in terms of building up savings and pensions and so forth. Just to give you an idea, we haven't done a huge amount of estimates yet, but for South Africa, this is minutes per day in terms of production, so SNA production. There you can see there's quite a big difference between men and women. As Gretchen says, it rolls a whole lot of issues into this. So, for example, unemployment amongst women being higher would lower their time spent in SNA production. But if we look at time in unpaid household production and care work, we see for women much higher time spent in those activities. And we also see two peaks, sort of in the late 20s and early 30s, and then again we see in the early 60s again. And so I think this is one of the areas where it will be quite interesting to see what's happening in terms of multi-generational families and how the elderly are helping support households through providing care. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you. So I'm going to say what we learned in NTA when doing this work for Kenya, and also what we hope to learn in NTTA from now onwards. Now, so the one thing that we actually surprised us when we got into NTA research is if you look at the GDP figures, one number like per capita income, so it's like 100 rand in 1 year. But we were able to learn that 100 for that 1 year can be broken down, showing how it can be distributed by age, so that we know what is being produced at each age and what is being consumed and saved. Okay. And when we presented that information to policymakers, they were able to relate to that profile very well. They found that they could use that information to design and implement social protection programs. Okay. Now, the other thing that as researchers we took in is the methodology for doing this decomposition. Yeah, actually, when you see this, when these graphs being drawn, it looks very easy, just one line and the other one. But actually, it takes a lot of work to draw those graphs. Okay, I remember when Professor Mason came to give a lecture in Kenya. So students saying, "Oh, but that's very easy." Actually, I need to stand up and say that it's extremely difficult. Okay. So the methodology itself is very interesting with a lot of rules to follow and so on. Okay, so then, but this NTA, as nice as it is, has some limitations. Gretchen has already explained, so I will not repeat. So now, in this counting women's work, Mone and also Gretchen, they have shown some what more or less we should expect. But I want to highlight one thing about this counting women's work. Now, so the work which is the output, which is not reflected in SNA, in National in the national product account actually occurs in 3 areas: in the home, okay, in the enterprise like a shop, and also on the farm where crops are grown. What happens, especially in Africa, is during the day, the functions of the woman, okay, in the home migrate to the farm. So there, she takes care of the children there. When the young girls come there, they also take care of the children, also the boys and so on. So on the farm, during the day, the farm is like a home. Also, when women are selling these things, the informal sector, that is also, during the day, is also a home. Okay? So this unpaid work also takes place there. Okay? So it's not just taking place in one fixed area. Okay? It's taking place in several places. And what we hope to do is actually design a method of capturing it wherever it is occurring. So now, what we also learned when we were presenting our work to the policymakers is it's very difficult to explain some concepts of NTA, something like the demographic dividend. If you try to explain that to policymakers, even to researchers ourselves, it's very hard. Okay, so we need to learn how to communicate the meaning of a key concept like the dividend, the demographic dividend. Actually, I'm going too far, and maybe that is all. So we also learn how to write papers. Okay, thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting Benin team here today for presenting the relevance for Benin of generational economy in general, but in particular counting women's work. First, it's okay? Okay. We want to point on the motivation for Benin for counting women conducting this study in Benin is to address specific research questions by adding gender and time use to NTA estimates. Yesterday we have shared the first result we have got with our colleagues in the workshop. Second is to help to improve the status of women by making their economic contribution more visible and valued. And finally, to assess the distribution of paid and unpaid work performed by men and by women. For the policy relevance, we can say that we want to see how can government promote inclusive growth with an emphasis on women's economic empowerment. How can we reduce gender inequalities and strengthen social protection in Benin? The answers for issues formulated in our proposal are necessary for policymakers' decision because the promotion of women economic empowerment through women's labor market participation is in line with Benin's strategic development policy, where we can quote the document relating to the strategy of growth and poverty alleviation. Indeed, this axis is about women capacity building and combines the following dimensions: control of population, promotion of education, improvement of health status, promotion of decent employment, reduction of gender inequalities and strengthening of social protection. We can notice finally that government is making efforts towards this target by drawing policy strategies or by taking some laws. We can take as example a decree creating the Observatory of Social Change in Benin. Is translation, perhaps is not a good translation of what we call Observatoire Social du Bénin, which aims to follow and evaluate the impact of Benin national development policies, especially those relating to growth promotion, poverty alleviation, and the attainment of Millennium Development Goals. You can quote also the decree creating the Observatory of Family, Women, and Children at the Ministry of Family, Women, and National Solidarity. The objective of this observatory is to follow changes in gender issues and the conditions of women and children's life. That is the main issues relating to the involvement of Benin team in this network. Thank you very much.
Good evening. It's the turn of Ghana. And in the case of Ghana, what actually interested us regarding NTA was the fact that the NTA can be used to compute demographic dividends. And in addition to that, it can also provide information on the distribution of resources according to generation in the Ghanaian economy. And when we talk about demographic dividends, we're talking about the increase in economic growth or income as a result of reduction in fertility. We know that Ghana has been enjoying high economic growth these years. So we wanted to know to what extent was this growth due to reduction in fertility. The main research questions that we had for our work under the NTA was who produces and who benefits according to age. So we have those who are suppliers and those who are net consumers. Who are they? And have we achieved the demographic dividends as an economy? When did we do that? If yes, and for how long can we enjoy it? In addition, with the help of the NTTA, we also wanted to find out how unpaid housework production changes according to sex. And we had very interesting results. Now, if you look at the first one, like the distribution of resources according to age, as you saw from Gretchen's presentation, we have consumption profile, that is the red line, and the labor income profile. As you can see from our slide, age below 35, people below 35 are net dependents. So it takes a long time before the average Ghanaian actually becomes self-sufficient. And that is 35, age 35. If you had looked at Gretchen's one for the United States, it was less than 30. So this is a sign of very high youth unemployment or youth underemployment in our economy. And of course, we also have dependency rates after 60. The retirement age in Ghana is 60. So after 60, people at the age 60, people are self-sufficient, but just after that, they become dependent again. And look at how the income, actually, the average income drops sharply after 60. That is something that needs a lot of attention to the government. And we also found that, yes, we have enjoyed demographic dividends. And in fact, we had it as far back as 1990, and we didn't know. We didn't know that all these high economic growth that we've been enjoying is partly because of the reduction in our fertility rate. So that is good news to us. And according to the information too, we can enjoy it all the way up to 2050. So we have a lot to enjoy, but what can we do with that? Of course, the NTTA, the sex aspect to it, we found out, as we expected, that when it comes to household activities, according to age and sex, younger women or younger females spend so much time doing household work compared to males. There isn't much change for males. It's like almost horizontal throughout the ages. But when you look at women, the younger ones work a lot in the house, but as they get older, and it goes all the way up to like 70, 80, that is when they actually reduce housework. And if you also look at household care, caring for the elderly or caring for children, women within the childbearing age spend so much time on their children. As you can see, the difference is so wide relative to men. And they go down a little bit after 80, but still, you can see that the men do not spend as much time caring for the aged or for children. They don't do that much work. So that is some of the findings we had. So just to summarize our findings, we saw that dependency age ranged between 0 and 34. So people between 0 and 34 would need some support from somewhere before they can actually get all the consumption they need. And also between 63 and 90 also need dependents. Demographic dividend was enjoyed since 1990. Females spend more time, taking care of doing housework, and we're saying that that could be the reason why we have higher female dropout from school. I mean, we don't know. That could be a reason. And that is something we can explore, because before you can solve a problem, you have to find a cause. So we can look at that in the future. So for policy implications, we propose that there is a need to reduce youth unemployment, so that we can reduce the period within which people are dependent. And we also need to take full advantage of our demographic dividend by reducing unemployment. And we need to solve the problem of high school dropouts. So this is the experience of Ghana.
Good evening, everybody. Apologies for my English is not very good because but I try to speak, and this to present to you my team, Senegal team, and also what NTA is important for us in Senegal and this project of countryman work. Then our context is that in Senegal we have a high incidence of poverty, which is 47% in 2010, and also we have problem to attain to MDG objectives. We have a problem of unemployment, underemployment, and also economic program do not match social demand. And we have a big question which we try to respond is can NTA methodology can help us answer important policy questions? And the response is NTA can link macroeconomics aggregate with population age structure, which is generational economics, and then we try to frame some information and policies for policymakers and for audience in our countries. Then we have a first estimation of NTA for Senegal, which is there. We have in red the income profile, and you see that you have here the problem of child who work in Senegal, and we have a profile of consumption, which is in green. That's mean, and at the aggregate, we show here that we have a lot of deficit from young people. And now our problem now in our big problem, which also an opportunity, which can be because our problem of dividend, demographic dividend is this youth. We have a lot. The deficit is big, and how to do now? Then we have this deficit, which is 47% of GDP in 2005. It's very, very big, and the surplus is start on 35 and just finish at 60. And is only 25 years. It's not big if you compare to other countries like developed countries. Then this is how we finance this deficit. That is new for this graph at each age. In red you have the deficit. That's the deficit at each age, and we finance it by net transfer and asset-based and asset reallocation. Then what we know is that overall the deficit is funded by reallocation of assets at the level of 68% and the net transfer at the level of 32%. And also we have this problem that which is very, very important for us, and which have a important social implication is first dividend, demographic dividend, which starts here on 2000, around 2000, 1997 precisely, and which will continue to 2015. Then we don't know that because there is a big change in Senegal now. There's this change in 2000, for example, for the story. This change have implication to we change the politics. We have new politics because we change the president. But we don't know that that's youth. That is the youth which asked this demand to change the politics. And we have the first president, which is what, and which come. And after 12 years, also there is problem because there is problem of employment. And now this youth also, they say that is not, this president is not what, don't do what we want. And now we have a new president, which is more younger. And we hope that he can do best for us and for the youth. Then continual work is important for us because Senegal is an specific, like each country is specific because in on sociological points there's 1945% of Muslim. Then men don't work at home in general. They work a small time. And we need to more understand this and this problem. We have also a big inequality which comes from that. And we think that this project of continuing work, we can have information to inform policies and to take to let them take action for to try to have better life in Senegal. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, you don't have any result to present. So, but you have been invited to participate to this workshop because you are just the newest team of this network. So, you just come here to observe and to see how things work. So you are a new team. And our motivation is about Côte d'Ivoire that recently experienced a 10 years political army conflict from April 22 to 22 to April 2011 as a post-electoral world. Many international organizations mentioned the decline of economy. And so now, and migration during the 10 years conflict. What you think about that? It is this context may be useful to understand how to link conflict and age consumption or production profile. So for that fact, you are here, firstly, for capacity building. That is the more important things for Côte d'Ivoire. That means that you need to produce statistics and social and economic information for our target groups in order to enhance decision making. What is our group, target group? You have a politic, etc. And before talking about this group or target group, what are our objectives? Objective one, you aim to capture changes in many indicators. So you want to make a comparison between before and after the 10-year conflict. It will be challenging to know the changes in, for instance, per capita consumption, and to learn how each age group consume and produce before and after the conflict. A kind of a relationship that I told you before. The assumption that you can test, it is that the youngest elders are those who are now experiencing some weaker per capita consumption because of think that there is less transfer between the worker and the youngest and the elders. So many persons as well lost lands, physical capital, livestock, homes, and their jobs. So you think that transfer change a lot. So you think that the figure could be more different from all things maybe you have seen now. So hopefully you will get that quickly that you can. Our second objective is more recently that Côte d'Ivoire experienced a new law about equality, fairness within households. Now the new law said that husbands and wives should have the same rights. No one can say that is the head in the household. Before, the head is person, it was the man, is the man who decides where to live, where who earn money, etc. Now the law is different, and so it could be nice to see how the implication about this. How many hours do men work spend on home production? Hopefully, law could change that. How do the age time use profile looks like after this law? You hope that things goes quickly that you can, as you expect. That is an expectation as well. Our target groups is Ministry of Planning and Development, Ministry of Family, Women and Child, Ministry of Youth and Labor, national and international bodies are a lot in Côte d'Ivoire, and you hope that they will open the door to understand what you want to say, what you have to say about this kind of issues. Okay, thank you very much.
So thank you very much for all of our African country team representatives. So we have one colleague with us at the workshop from Europe, and I will see, how much time, how are we doing on our time count? Okay, well, we would be happy to tell you about Europe some other time because we need to move to questions and answers. Thank you, Yoja, for being willing. And so as we move to questions and answers, I will go back and just close me talking by saying that if you want to learn more about counting women's work and national transfer accounts, here are the websites, and we have a National Transfer Accounts Manual now that was published by the United Nations, so all of our methodology is in that. And then here is a volume that came out in 2012 that really shows how many different, how the generational economy varies across countries and what we've been able to learn from national transfer accounts so far. So both of those are available as free PDF downloads. And now I would love to hear your questions.
Hello, I'm Yanina, master's student at UCT. I have a very simple, straightforward question. All the data that is used for these calculations, is it national data, or is it what data that NTA gathers? And is there if it's national data, how is the comparability across countries?
So on the market side, we have national accounts data, which is gathered in a systematic way, similarly across all countries. That's the system that produces GDP, which we all compare to one another. And then to disaggregate that by age, we use our household surveys, labor force surveys, income and expenditure surveys, and also for the government, for the public sector accounts, government reports and administrative data. So we have that one national level, and then from surveys and administrative data, we get the relative age differences for those flows. So that's what gives our market accounts. For the time transfer accounts, we start with a time use survey, and the time use surveys vary actually a lot across countries. So one of the things we're working on now is to figure out what measures are comparable across those surveys and how we can use them. And then the wage data comes from labor force surveys, and so those are vary somewhat across country, but we look for occupational wage data from those surveys.
Just a quick one. I'm Chijoke, PhD student at UCT here. Just about the data also, more especially the survey data, the time use data, because we've seen a lot of the graphs that show that men do little work at home, women, and then vice versa in terms of market work. How are these estimates weighted? That's these things, because it's important sometimes, because people we meet at home are mainly women. So those who you, so to speak, meet at so survey data usually, I think, is usually women that answer many questions. So if those who answer the questions are disproportionately women per se, and then our estimates, these things will reflect in our estimates. How much are we taking these things into account in terms of putting weights? That's very important.
Do you mean that there is potential for bias
Exactly.
in the answers because if women are consistently answering for men?
So if women are, if women are consistently saying that, for instance, yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So in that case, there's potential for bias in my own.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that we've done with some of the time use surveys is that we also have in labor force surveys, we also have hours worked asked about your paid market labor. So there we can compare those two sources. And so far in the when we've been able to do that, the differences haven't been that large, at least, and this is just on the paid market side. So at least we've been able to get a little bit of comfort that two completely different surveys were producing some of the same ranges of answers. And so that's one of the things that we need to investigate as we add more countries into that. If there are other sources that possibly were asked in a different way, that we can use to check these. But yeah, there are many sources of bias in these surveys, and also we're relying heavily on, because all of the surveys exist already, and people have done research on them. So we're also relying on the evaluations that other experts have done to know what the major problems are and if there's anything we can do to correct them in using those data.
name is Esther, UCT student. I'm just wondering, for the main graph that is the main driving graph, my question is more about the consumption, particularly when you have incomes that are not just from wage income, like you have grants and that kind of a thing. So in measuring consumption, does it matter where the money that is used to buy or consume is the source of the money? Does it matter? Because I'm thinking in cases where you have, for instance, the case of South Africa, where you have a lot of grants that are to different targeted groups, they could influence how much the consumption figure is, and which particularly would affect the income, the difference between the working and the income, the consumption line. So how do you deal with that?
You mean, how do we estimate the consumption for each person?
I mean, particularly, sorry, I think it's the phone. Particularly for where you have consumption and you're comparing the graph where you have the labor.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the consumption is not necessarily just from labor income, right?
That's true, yeah.
So that's just what I'm wondering, how you're dealing with the consumption.
Okay, so the consumption data comes from consumption or expenditure surveys. So, and those surveys often have the income questions as well. So, so we observe at the household level how much is being consumed, and then distribute that to the individuals within the household based on consumption weights or based on data-driven methods where those are appropriate. Now, there is going to be more consumption than labor income in a household, and that will be financed oftentimes, and that will be financed by asset income if the household has assets that are earning income. If they own the home, if it's owner-occupied housing, there is also asset income being accrued from the use of that home. And there's also dissaving that can finance consumption higher than labor income, so going into debt. And then there are also transfers from, some countries have very large transfers from populations that migrate for work. So there's a big transfer into those households that supports consumption. And then there are government transfers as well. So labor income, we mark the compare the consumption to labor income to get an estimate of how many of these other resources have to be commanded to support the consumption. I'm not sure I answered your question, I hope so, but please clarify if I was not in the ballpark.
I think it's not too far. My concern was mainly because you're dealing with survey data, you have national level data, you have different sources of income, and you have this consumption, and you're really measuring it against labor, like people who are working, yet you'd have a lot of influencing incomes that are coming in that are consumed at the same. So I think it's clear, but I guess probably because I'm not very conversant with the work, so it's okay.
Well, hopefully we can talk more about it afterwards, because I still feel like I'm not understanding the issue, but. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I should have asked any of the other NTA participants to please comment on any of these questions. Pardon me.
So on that question, I mean, I think what we're doing is we're saying this is labor income at each age, this is consumption at each age. Now, obviously, households receiving grants, so the elderly that are receiving grants, for example, they're consuming because they're spending their grants. So, but when we look at labor income, they might have zero for labor income. So what we're saying is there's this gap between what they're earning in the market and what they're consuming, and how are they financing that? They must be getting the money from somewhere. So they're getting the money from grants, they're getting it from their families in other households, they're getting it from, as Gretchen said, from assets, income, and so forth. So it's really sort of this decomposition of the gap between what you're earning in the market and what you're consuming, and saying, how are we financing that gap? So obviously in South Africa, you can see for the elderly big transfers in terms of the grants. When we decompose the public transfer inflows, you can see the child support grant, you can see the old age pension very, very clearly.
And I would add one other little note on that. So one of the interesting veins of research that's going on now in NTA is about the second demographic dividend. So if some of your old age support system is made up through people saving assets during their working years, that can provide capital to make the labor more productive, which can help to grow your way out of population aging. So that's one, estimating how much that might be occurring or what the potential for that is one of the new or strong veins of research going on in NTA now.
Hi, I'm Sean Muller, DPIU. I just wanted to ask, so again, about how you do the calculations. When you, the shadow price, or the shadow wage you use for women's labor, do you vary that by their position within the broader income distribution? So for example, do you take into account the fact that their spouse, if they have a spouse, might earn more? If they don't have a spouse, how would you, so for example, you might think that you might say use women's level of education, for example. And so a woman who's got a university level of education, the shadow price, shadow cost of her doing housework might be higher on a market level. Mm-hmm. But education is only one proxy. There might be a bunch of others. For example, you might use the spouse's income, but in a lot of cases, single woman households, it would seem to be something difficult. So I was wondering how you do that.
Yeah. So in the literature trying to estimate the value of household production, when you begin, you make a very important decision when you get to the wage imputation. Are you going to impute based on an opportunity cost method, or are you going to impute a wage based on the replacement method? So our methodology uses the replacement method. So the sort of thought experiment is, what would you have to pay if tomorrow you decided you're going to purchase it instead of do it yourself? So if tomorrow I decide I'm going to have someone else do my laundry, what's the wage I'm going to have to pay that person? So that's the replacement method that we're using. The opportunity cost method we're not using because we think that that's more appropriate to questions of behavioral, of decisions, of how you decide whether you're going to do something at home or you're going to purchase it in the market. So sticking with national accounting, which is an accounting framework, and trying to add up the value of what's being produced, when we move to the non-market side, we're trying to maintain that outlook, that it's an accounting of value being produced, not opportunity cost, but just the value of what is being produced. So there are different ways to impute the wages based on different research questions. And for the NTA and NTTA frameworks, we are more on a value of the service. So we take an average wage in the market, not the wage based on the person who might decide to not do that activity. But thank you, that's a very important question in this vein of research.
Okay, I had a sign which said time up, all right, written down, and I'm glad to say that I didn't have to use it once at all. So clearly between Gretchen and Mornay, they've kept to time. I want to thank everybody for attending and for joining us here. In particular, I do want to thank our resident photographer, Sarah Marriott, Wasima, who's at the back, and Liesel, who's somewhere here, Liesel George, who stepped out. If we could please just give them a round of applause, especially for the workshop attendees, because I think together with Mornay, they've worked incredibly hard. I had a challenge to the team, which is when you look at these life cycle surpluses and deficits, it'll be really useful to look at the comparison across countries and see what are the different drivers in those deficit values and surpluses. It's grants in South Africa, but what else is going on in the case of Ghana and elsewhere? And that'll be really interesting. Thanks very much, everybody.